So without any further delay, I'd like to welcome Claire to begin today's webinar.
Thank you so much to Kirsty and to Sharon and to GTCS once again for having me here today. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to share some ideas, some thoughts, some strategies around coaching and around leadership that might support our leaders at this time. I'm especially grateful to our school leaders who are joining us today during the school holidays, but it is a holiday like no other, isn't it? And I appreciate that this week might be your first week where you've had a modicum of headspace to reflect on how things have been and what's coming next. But I also appreciate that within that space, there is also the anticipation of what's to come, and perhaps even anxiety at times, especially as we move through July. So what I would like to offer you today are just some thoughts that might support you in framing how you wish to approach the coming weeks. And I appreciate that this time of rest and recovery is imperative before Mr. Swinney's next announcement, when we will have maybe a clearer picture as to what's to come. I'd like to start off saying that the reason I chose the Being a Leader in a New World title is based on some of my own thinking and some of the webinars that I've been attending recently. And only last week I attended a webinar on coaching, and it was called Leading in Times of Uncertainty. And a number of renowned coaches from around the world were discussing the whole idea of what it is to lead in times of uncertainty, particularly through this pandemic and its impact. And a couple of things resonated with me that I'd like to share with you today in the first few slides. But I also wish to say that I have shaped today's session based on the previous feedback, or rather the feedback from the previous session which we had a couple of weeks ago. But back to this webinar that I was listening to, some of the comments coming from coaches were on this whole idea of the world never being the same again. Yet in this time, leaders still trying to do what they've always done. And they talked about this idea of disembodied leadership, whereby they were noticing that there were leaders in prominent positions throughout the world, throughout organisations, where they were still trying to do what they'd always done, but there was a real disconnect, a real disembodiment from what was happening on the ground to what they perceived to be the priorities. And I suppose it made me think about our schools just now, which need a grounded, fully present and embodied leadership. So it made me think of you right now. Now, you might not have felt too embodied in the last number of months when there's been so much to process and so much to go through. But the reason I want to mention this today is that when we have that embodied leadership, it allows us to physically, cognitively, emotionally regulate not just ourselves, but regulate other people within our community who are perhaps feeling quite dysregulated and disconnected and maybe need some of that support. So just to make the point too, we're still very much in recovery, and we will be in August as well. But we do look as if we are moving towards some semblance of normality, and we see that even today with announcements about phase 3. We are still living with uncertainty though, because we don't know what will happen with this virus, and we hope we have suppressed it sufficiently. But some questions I would like you to consider today are around this idea of how do we cultivate resilience whilst remaining adaptive? And we also see opportunities to transform what we've been doing through the lessons of lockdown, but we also may be feeling quite overwhelmed. So what can support us to keep a clear focus so we are investing our time and energy appropriately in the right ways to build for the long-term plans, and not simply just investing time and energy to something that will not bear fruit? And that's difficult in recovery, because recovery plans of their essence are always going to be short-term and short-lived. So I want to start today with this first slide, just to give you a thread of the discussion on the presentation. I am going to be speaking in the first couple of slides about putting yourself first, self-care as a leader. You know, there was a study that's cited in Daniel Goleman's book on emotional intelligence from 1996, and the study was carried out in 93 by Peck. And Peck asked military leaders what were their top 5 priorities which enabled them to be effective leaders. And of the leaders who were identified, the military leaders who were identified as being actually effective, they were the ones who put themselves and their own self-care first. and they spoke about their self-care being an act of survival, in that if they did not resource themselves and regulate themselves in a fully embodied, present way, grounded way, they couldn't in good conscience send their troops out to the front line to endure what they had to endure. And I think that that's very necessary for us now as leaders as we move through this holiday, to rest, to recover for ourselves and recuperate, but also to recognise it's not an indulgence. It is in fact a necessity in order to be prepared for our return. I also want to examine this idea of workload, our relationship, a new relationship with work, the boundaries we put in place. And another aspect to the webinar today will be around this idea of navigating your way as a leader through recovery and through an unprecedented time. Overwhelm is going to be inevitable. It has been inevitable. You've all experienced it at times. But what came through in this webinar I was listening to, and what's becoming more and more apparent to me, is this idea of well-being in connection to the difficulties and the challenges we face. And it made me think of this question, that, you know, what if it is exactly the difficulties that we face now that will provide us with our greatest learning and energy to move our communities forward in ways that would never have happened without this crisis? Now, that's a huge question. There are lots of facets to that. But that idea of well-being related to the difficulties, as opposed to well-being related to just being comfortable and dealing with our comfort in a situation, is something that I wish to talk about in this next slide. As I say in this webinar, one of the quotes that really struck me was this one about cultivating resilience. And this quote here about how we harness the capacity to turn towards the difficulty, almost like leaning in, as opposed to finding ways to stay comfortable when difficulties arise. And I think traditionally, well-being in our schools, and I'm aware of this as well as from the coaching that I've done, well-being in our schools can sometimes allow us to get to a place of feeling comfortable, but sometimes in just being comfortable and using mindfulness techniques and using ways to de-stress, and although they keep us comfortable, there is also the danger, I suppose, that we could be staying stuck without addressing some of the difficulties. Well, this pandemic has thrown up perhaps all of those difficulties. And as I said in the last session, no crisis arrives alone. It may have exacerbated relationships, difficult relationships we've had with staff previously, which have really come into light now. But what if those difficulties now are those new opportunities to really do things differently? And they talk in this webinar about recovery as a transformational opportunity. And yes, instinctively we know this, but it is challenging. And I think when I've been reflecting on this, I've been thinking about this concept of this idea of stretching, you know, those stretch goals that we've maybe considered in the past, moving out of our comfort zones. But I think more than ever, it has to be paced in a way that still grounds us and is still allowing us to manage the stress that we are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So if we're going to be manageable, if it's going to be manageable and realistic, it has to be done in a way that perhaps is a slower pace than from what we have done before. And this might be new to us all, that slower pace. It might feel uncomfortable because we think, well, if we're not busy, what are we actually getting done if we're not busy? But in fact, it is perhaps about becoming more strategic with our reflection time and our time to come together to deepen our learning as to what the lessons are within lockdown and within the recovery time that we're experiencing just now. And it's about that, you know, rest and recovery being essential at this particular time. It's not a luxury to take time out and protect time as a staff and as a team to reflect on how we are feeling and how we use those feelings to fuel the actions that we take in the future. So as I say, putting myself first is a necessity, and indeed I would say it is not a luxury. So what I would say about this kind of new relationship just now is that we have an opportunity as leaders to do it differently. One of the themes that again is coming up for me as I coach, as I present to schools, as I work with different groups, I'm recognising that the world we knew doesn't exist any longer. And yes, there are aspects of it that perhaps exist, but things have radically moved, and at some pace. It really is a landscape crisis which has generated the change. So why should it be different for us in our own relationships with work? You can certainly go back to how you did work before and had that relationship with work before. Or is there a new way to do work? Is there a new way to do it differently? And what are we learning from that experience? Some things that occur for me just now are the boundaries that we have recognised we could put in place in lockdown, or indeed maybe we couldn't. So what has to be the new way in working as we move forward? When do we make ourselves available to others, and when do we not? And when do we make ourselves available in school physically, and when are we not available even when we are physically in school and protecting our time? And who needs to know this? Because perhaps we have learned through lockdown, and certainly this is an example I've experienced, where some leaders have said to me, actually my staff did so well and self-organised and managed really well without me, whereas when I've been in the building, people were very reliant on asking me the questions, which they found answers to themselves. So can we carry that learning? Can we make our team aware that such learning has taken place, and why should it be different now? And also this idea of what we can be responsible for. I asked this in the last session. You know, we're certainly responsible as leaders for how we put out our messages, how we respond to different situations. But we cannot always be responsible for other people's reactions and responses. We each have our own agency, and what we do with that is our own responsibility. So just being mindful of what you can and are expected to take on board as a leader may not be as fitting now as it was before, or it may just not be who you need to be for people now. Also, this idea of a realistic schedule. This comes up for me because what, again, I'm getting greater clarity on in working with people is that even with a recovery plan, you will make great plans and have great ideas as to what you may wish to take forward. But please recognise this, that some things will just never be done. They'll just not get done. And therefore come into a place of acceptance that as we move through this, some things will have to drop off, or they will just not get done. And it's not because you are inefficient with your timetabling or your management of energy. It's just physically not possible. So coming to a growing acceptance that, you know, by the end of a week, having some sort of review that allows us to look at, well, what did we get done? And that relates to a point further down about what I've achieved for today. You know, just having a post-it note, or before my head hits the pillow of an evening, having a sense of accomplishment that I have done something that made a difference today, even if it was just having my lunch or something that seems a little trivial, but in fact, I'm being a bit facetious there. But you know, something that did make a difference to you, and that it was crossed off a list, or it did make a difference to someone. And also time for self and time for meaningful connections. As we recover, we will find more and more we have no time or energy for connections and relationships with others that don't build us up. So I think we need to get very clear for ourselves about what does support us and who has got us in times of difficulty, because we will need their strength and support at this time. And lastly, reflection on your drivers. Every day, just checking in with ourselves. Is it my fear that's driving me, or is it my passion? And there will be times when fear does have an element of truth in their day. You know, it might be a risk assessment. We're a bit concerned if we've got everything correct there, and certain things will definitely matter in that respect. But if fear becomes a predominant driver, then perhaps I then start to respond from a place that is unresourceful and is not as embodied as I need it to be, so that I can regulate others. So recognising that if my fear is coming from getting it wrong, am I frightened of getting it wrong? Am I frightened of what others will say or what others will do? That's not a great place to be operating from. We need to get back to that place of our core values, beliefs, and our passion, our why.
Claire, I'm, you know, in awe of new head teachers at the moment, those who are defying the fear because
Yes.
they're being driven by their passion just now. And I absolutely take my hat off to any new head teacher who is going into school now in this current climate that we have, without the relationships in place already and being driven by their passion. I think it's remarkable.
It is remarkable, and it says a lot for, I think it says a lot for the quality of our candidates who increasingly are coming through. And I think as well, it is about that sense of purpose has never gone away for any leader in education. That sense of making a difference, that sense of wanting, that desire to get it right for our school communities, it comes through very clearly in new head teachers taking up the mantle of being a figurehead within the school community. And I think that's why if we can get the putting yourself first bit right for our new leaders, then perhaps the rest can be more sustainable. And for those of us in more experienced positions, looking at reviewing how we put ourselves first from that place of passion, necessity, and an act of survival. And I think once we've got some ideas of our own self-care and our commitment to ourselves, we can then start to explore the opportunities with our school community, our teams, our staff teams, our pupils, and start to consider what is our vision, our mission, and our desired outcomes. And I think this does resonate perhaps and is a good starting point for new head teachers, because as new head teachers coming in, it's about that kind of sense of co-creation. But what I would say is that no matter how much experience you have as a school leader, the revisiting of this idea of our vision at a time of recovery and at a time when there's that word again, these unprecedented challenges that we're facing or crises that we've had or are in the middle of, there is a necessity to review who we are as a school community, and there's also an opportunity for renewal. What opportunities are emerging from this that can shape the way in which we take our school community forward together, and what no longer serves us, and what are the lessons that we have from our lockdown. So what I'd like to provide just now are just some examples, offerings of how other people have done things. It's not exhaustive. I've only got an hour. I don't have all the answers, but it's just to promote the thinking to get us on our way. So there is this model that was developed for staff wellbeing called the PERMA model, and it comes out of Martin Seligman's work on Flourish and the positive psychology constructs that he developed about what is it to have good staff wellbeing in any workplace, in any organisation. And these are the 6 pillars on the left-hand side that he has set up as constructs which have been researched in ways in which he has set up studies and designed research for. And I think they are, it's very interesting, his work, and it's very, it's really enlightening, the work that he has done in terms of getting us to think a bit more about the emotional aspects of work and how they do impact in the workplace. But I think as well, there are perhaps some limitations with what we need in a start back in August. And I'll get to that in a moment. But certainly, if you were to get onto the website for the University of Pennsylvania, Martin Seligman's website, he has got questionnaires there, which you can all fill in. It's all for free, and it gives you a kind of breakdown as to how your positive emotions are, how your relationships are, your perception of these are. And certainly whole staff groups can do that. But beyond that, I'm not sure in terms of the frameworks we have in our schools, how that would tie in with that. But here's an example of a study carried out by Margaret Hearn in a school. And it's just in the one school, which I think limits this kind of study, but it is an interesting study. But one school in Adelaide in Australia, St Peter's School, where they based their wellbeing approach around these pillars. What's interesting for me in this, though, is that it was the meaning of people's work, the engagement in the work, and the accomplishment that made a difference to staff wellbeing, quite predominantly from this. I suppose what this illustrates for me is that there are perhaps limitations in what we need to have in place in order to move forward. And I would be looking for a much more organic and co-created approach, which might support our sense of togetherness at a time. I think with an approach like this, sometimes it can be done to you. And I think it's important about that idea of co-creation. And I know you might want to say something about this just now, Sharon.
Thanks, Claire. I do, because I think actually what we have here fits in quite nicely with what you're saying about the PERMA model. So for the launch of the Unlocking the Potential of PRD last year, GTCS created, along with yourself, with your support, we created 4 big resources on culture and climate of trust based around this coaching wheel. And it was all in thinking about having the right culture and climate of trust so that PRDs were successful. But actually having a culture and climate of trust really feeds into staff health and wellbeing, doesn't it? And actually here I think there's an opportunity, as you were saying, having that joint vision, planning together about what we could do next, perhaps even identifying any gaps that need closed. That's all actually there in that resource that we have on our website. So I think Kirsty will put a link to where you can find them on our website, and it might be an opportunity for schools to tweak those resources if they were interested in just checking that temperature for themselves as far as wellbeing is concerned, or where trust is, or even swapping in and out some of the headings and putting or adding additional one about health and wellbeing. There's a basis for a good piece of work that could be done in schools just now to support that going forward. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to share that.
Thanks very much, Sharon. And I think you've hit the nail on the head there with the idea of trust being a starting point. Because I think trust may have been lost along the way during the lockdown. We might have been out of relationship with some people at times, or not even that. People perhaps have had their own experiences of messaging that they've not been able to trust, whether it's a societal message, whether it's a political message. So trust and the polarisation of that is very apparent, I think, in our society just now. So with our staff coming from their own experiences of lockdown, I think having a much more organic approach can be much more supportive. And this is a point picked up in Andy Buck's book on what makes a great school. And this quote, he talks about setting out a clear path for a clear school culture or school development, where there is, he says, an organic sense of self-improvement fueled by the genuine and self-motivated desire of all individuals to make things better. That's what we're all about as school leaders. We always want to make things better. I think that's at everyone's core in our leadership roles in school. But that idea then of, having it organic, keeping it simple, I think is important. Taking people with you and coming from a place of creating it together, co-creation, I think at this stage will really build that trust in a much more meaningful way, and also build our plans and build the buy-in that we need to enact those plans in a way that helps everyone to move forward. So to use this, I've just based this on a coaching tool that I've used time and time again, 2 circles exercise. Now it should be called the 2 circles, a cloud and an arrow. I do appreciate that. It's a misnamed slide, isn't it? But if we were to start with our vision, it's not necessarily how you would use the 2 circles, but I want to start with our vision. What are the new possibilities? What can we get excited about? And I think it is about the more we feel about wanting to make a difference, the more that will sustain us, the more excited we can feel about it, and what will reward us as well. What will be the accomplishment? That will also support us as well. So just in a discussion with staff, really mapping that out, asking these questions, I think is a really great starting point. And I've used something similar as a head teacher, just something that's quite organic. But we also need to take cognizance of where are we now? And it might be you want to look at, well, where were we before the pandemic? Or where were we at the end of the term there? But also recognising, have there been stories that we've been telling ourselves as a school community before that we need to challenge now? And we need to stop getting stuck in those stories. And therefore, what needs to be renewed? What needs to continue? And what are the new things then that we wish to take forward? And then considering what it is we need to achieve these, the steps we need to take, our new story. Then we start to think about how feasible and how possible this is. In recovery, what will matter coming out of recovery, what will continue to matter, and what will always matter to us. And what I've got here in this cloud is the facing the challenges. Now, often when you're talking to people about what they might be facing, and we ask as coaches, what do you perceive to be the inhibitors or the obstacles? I think there's an issue there, though, is in that we just don't know necessarily. And I think a much more pertinent question to ask is not what are the challenges, but no matter the challenges, how will we respond when they come? What will we need, and what might we learn about our approaches? And again, that idea of leaning in. And if we map some of that out and we start to get some of those ideas, and it could be around specific vision, it could be about a specific vision for staff well-being, it could be a specific vision for whole school well-being, like the Margaret Kern study I showed earlier, or it could be a completely different part of the work that you're doing within your community. But once we've mapped some of that out, I realised that in that tool, there's not the place to maybe talk about the values and beliefs. Now, again, taking a very simple coaching tool, but applying it to something that's much more collective. And this is just an example of, you know, what I might have a discussion with a client around if they were finding a challenging conversation difficult with a particular member of staff. So we write the goal down, but we talk about our core being our values and our beliefs. So we go to our values and beliefs after we've identified our goal to think, well, what is it that drives us? What supports us in challenging some of those behaviours that we're seeing in other people that we don't want to see, etc. And therefore, thereafter, rather, we look at the internal resources that I would need and the external resources. And that's great on an individual basis. But let's bring it into a collective context. Let's bring it into a context where we have well-being for all as central to our work in achieving our outcomes for this community. So if well-being is our kind of main mission just now and our main goal, what are the values and beliefs that underpin that? Now, this is just a worked example, just to give you an idea. It's got to come from your teams, and it could be fed into by parental voice and pupil voice as well. But I've just taken the values from the recovery document just now, so safe, fair and ethical, but I've also added in compassion, because that's a favourite value of mine. And also just identifying those beliefs and not overdoing the beliefs, but just looking at some collective beliefs that are patterns for us. These are the things we keep saying time and time again. As a leader, I think one of our roles is to look for the patterns, listen for the phrases and the language that people are coming out with, and what does it say about where they are at. And I think it's about, in this case, you know, looking at the positive language that we're using what people are feeling just now through that language, and using that to build our beliefs about what matters most.
Claire, can I just come in there?
Please do.
We spoke at length the other day when we were planning this session about perhaps adding in another column that gave words to the inhibitors or the blocks that are in the way of us achieving our goals, based around a success analysis coaching tool that we've used previously. And then we discussed that actually, or you rightly said, if we did that, then perhaps we weren't giving the acknowledgement as it being important, that sometimes those inhibitors or blocks are important to people because that's where they are. And we needed to acknowledge that properly without just lining them up as something that's not of value. And you came up with, or we discussed about safe spaces, which is what's in the next column.
So just building on from that, Sharon, thanks very much for this opportunity just to talk about that. But I've put in safe spaces and protected time to reflect together. You know, it's about recognising people are going to have difficult emotions and they're going to want to express difficult emotions, and that's okay. When it becomes a pattern of responses, then we would need to have that kind of one-to-one conversation, most certainly. But even in having that one-to-one conversation, there's still a place for that person to express what they need to express, and for us to hold some of that for them, but and allow them just to process that. Because certainly in my work as a coach, every time I have a coaching session, there is an element to every coaching session whereby you are just holding a space for people. And although it's uncomfortable for people to express their aversion, their distaste, their upset, their grief, their trauma, it is a necessary part of healing. And it is a very necessary part of them embodying who they are in that particular moment and allowing them to process it so they can shift. If we start to dampen people's expression, if we try to suppress, that's a better word, if we try to suppress the emotions, it's perhaps going to lead to greater difficulty along the road. Now, I appreciate we can't have an inordinate amount of time just dedicated to that. There are lots of things to do in a busy school, but it is, I think, about being strategic about protected time and space to reflect together, so that those suppressed emotions do not become a bigger issue further down the road.
I think it's also worthwhile saying as well, Claire, that it's not necessarily the head teacher's responsibility to offer the safe space, and we don't need to carry everybody's emotions, which it's hard enough at times managing our own, managing everybody else's, but as long as we provide opportunities for there to be a safe space with whoever that may be, that's important.
Thank you. And that goes back to the idea of responsibility. What can I be responsible for? And I can't take on everybody's emotions. That's not possible. But it is about providing, as you say, those opportunities, organisations, resources, connections, groups within staff who can support with that. I know there are a lot of schools working on staff wellbeing groups and developing some of that. So very much. I think in this external column, I've just made mention of plan of actions. Because in this is not a detailed plan, but it is a foundation for us to move forward. You might want to then, on the back of this, think about other plans to take things forward. And here is a kind of, this isn't a kind of plan per se. Again, it's to get ideas generated and to give people a sense of we're moving, and we're moving in different ways. And it gives us hope, and it gives us a sense that there is a different way to do school. There is a different way to do what we've been doing. And it's called the Ideas Stretcher Tool, and I've used this with groups before. And here is I've taken a very extreme idea that came out, I suppose, of lockdown. And what I was very struck by during lockdown is the amount of independent learning taking place in secondary schools, particularly with young people who were not sitting exams. And it made me think about this as an example. And please forgive me, my background is not secondary. Any secondary leaders out there, please forgive me. I'm just playing, which is what I like to do. I just like to play with ideas at times. But if we take an initial idea and think about, right, how can we take this to an extreme? What might this look like, sound like, feel like? What are the sort of ideas we could come up with? So we write the most completely impossible version of the idea, taken to extremes. And I've had some great fun with some groups on this one before, on different examples. But then what we do is we tailor it to look at something that's a bit more innovative. And we look at something that's a bit more possible. We say, well, that's the extreme. Within this, what are the possibilities? What could we look at? And it's amazing, I always find, to hear what some people who perhaps haven't had a voice before can offer and can suggest when they're offered this opportunity to really, we've got a space to do things differently. And then we take that innovative idea and we look at something that's maybe ambitious and make it a bit more feasible. So this is just a tool, again, just as a kind of idea to think about our planning, thinking about ideas that are going to motivate us. And part of our well-being is to grapple with the difficulties and think, how can we make some of this a reality? And I think that that's a very important aspect of this.
Claire, could I just come in here? So we've had one comment from Anne Teresa, who says that great example of resilience from head teachers in schools just now. If anyone else would like to please add a comment, a thought, any suggestions or experiences that you've had, please feel free to share them through the questions pane.
Thanks so much. So the idea stretcher tool just now, what I would say about this is that follow-up is critical. So when we're putting all these plans together, it's about the building of trust. So staff need to know where it is going. They need to be aware that we're not going to waste people's time, because we need to ensure that whatever we're planning, we put in place as soon as we can, so that allows us to retain the motivational energy that we started to build in these initial sessions. So what I want to move to just now, again, is another idea, which I've looked at. And again, this was part of the feedback where I didn't go through some slides, so I will get to these slides today. So this is about this idea of fire, aim, fire. In a time of recovery, it is about much more responsive planning, not looking too far ahead, I understand, but looking far enough ahead that we can function and that we can still be resilient, as well as hopeful and optimistic for that future. So proceeding through recovery, this may be our preferred way of working. And just some of the points here I'd like to raise around what are we focused on? What are our core goals? So from what we've planned, or what we've started to look at, from that, what are the core priorities now, for next month, and possibly the month after, but maybe no more than that just now. And how do we keep things simple? And how do we capitalise on feedback sources, not just the formal sources we've got. Maybe some of the formal feedback sources don't fit any longer. Maybe it's more about the informal sources. We're getting comments that are made from parents, from staff members about what is working, what's not working. And looking at this idea of just because we've had something in place before doesn't mean we need to have it in place now. And it's not about the right or wrong of that, it's about what we need now. Similarly to a garden, we plant some seeds come through, they grow shoots, we water them, we nurture them, some things don't, so we move forward. And we focus on other areas of growth. And this is a book written by Jeff Sutherland, The Scrum Approach. The book is actually called Getting Twice the Work Done in Half the Time. I bought it on the basis of that title. I don't think I've mastered it yet, but I'm on my way there with some of these ideas. But I liked this notion. The Scrum Approach is very much like the rugby idea, where we are all moving together and we're all communicating together. And what he talks about in the book is that the old waterfall approach to planning that organisations have been using for very many years is defunct. And it's defunct because priorities are changing so quickly. Well, we've known that for many years, but it's very apparent now. Timelines therefore become defunct, and therefore it can be very demotivating that we've set out on one path and now we've got to change it. And so he talks about having a much more responsive approach called the Scrum and the Sprint approach, which is very much based on a systems theory approach, where we're taking feedback all the time and we're working on this feedback. And what he focuses on is that we just take one of the priorities and we plan it together, and we plan it just over a period of 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Imagine that, taking a school improvement plan priority and just, thrashing it out in 3 weeks. And what he talks about is that everyone knows the progress, because he talks about having daily stand-ups. That's not possible necessarily in schools, or maybe it is. But he talks about the necessity for there to be regular communication on the progress, and for it to be visual, for it to be visible. So he talks about just simply post-its on a grid such as this, the backlog grid, the doing grid, and the done grid. And I've taken an example here because this might come into a greater wellbeing plan, school wellbeing plan, whereby we're having to manage some of the anxieties that parents are having about what is happening in the school. So it might be for the first 2 weeks of the term, our focus as a whole team or a whole school is to focus on parental communication. How will we do it? What's the frequency? What's the content, etc. And for those next weeks, we might have working streams, but not working groups as such, who are working in silos, because we're coming together regularly. And we've all taken responsibility for doing an aspect of that. And we can follow up with each other in a Scrum approach where we're communicating with one another. So it's just an example, but it shows in a way in which those ethereal plans or notions or ideas can start to become a bit more concrete for us. And another part of this is that it allows us to be responsive. It is motivating because it allows us just to focus on this priority, get it done. We've achieved something, right? Then it allows us to, we've sprinted for 3 weeks, we rest for a week. We just get on with the other stuff we have to get on with. And then we build up towards another sprint. Maybe it's a rest of 2 weeks and another sprint. But it's a different way of managing our energy just now and our priorities. So again, just some thoughts there.
Claire, I think it's great from a pace point of view. Mm-hmm. We have things on our to-do list all the time, and sometimes they just get pushed back, but this keeps everybody accountable and everyone has ownership of it as well, which is always a challenge in school. So I really like this style of working.
That's a very good point, that ownership. And that idea, I suppose, back to the idea of empowerment and agency and accountability. We're all in it together. And what it also does is it allows everyone to focus on the same goals, and therefore there's not energy wasted on what we can't do. Because in the conversation, I've maybe missed this point actually, in the conversations about what obstacles are in your way, maybe other people within the team have ideas that are working in other work streams who can contribute to that. So again, it's a problem solving mechanism that's built into this as well. So yeah, really good.
And very visible. If you've got that up in your staff room wall, it's visible for everybody to contribute and discuss on. Yeah, great.
Very much. Back to this idea of people mentioned in the feedback, they love this idea of it's not about the tasks, it's about the stories. Tasks are important, but if I'm just doing tasks without that overarching story, I don't allow myself to become that embodied, grounded leader I need to be, and that we all need to be as a team. So again, going back to this idea of the stories that we can wrap our heads around. And I was thinking about this, and the underneath the tasks and the stories, I was thinking about what are sometimes the stories that we might tell ourselves about things going wrong. And I put up a question there, around, well, what's the worst that could happen? And in fact, on reflection, for some people, the worst has happened. Trauma and grief are real for our school communities and for ourselves, perhaps as individuals. And as I say, as I've always said, I'm available if anybody wants to get in touch, and I might not have the skills and the expertise to help you with some of your own aspects of well-being just now and dealing with some of this, but I have many friends and contacts who maybe can support you, so please don't hesitate to get in touch. But I was reading an article at the weekend, last weekend, about do you remember there was a programme called Educating Essex, and there was a head teacher in a school community, and it was a great programme, but the head teacher was interviewed, and at the weekend he talked about the fact that he has had in his school community 25 bereavements, and they interviewed another head teacher who'd also experienced a huge amount of grief within the school community and trauma and bereavement. But this Educating Essex head teacher talked about this idea that he is so upset and bereft for people. It's the most challenging time he's ever experienced as a head teacher, but he also can lean in. He can also get a sense of, we need to get it right. We now have a renewal of purpose, of mission, of vision to get it right for our participants, our members of our community. And it was this whole idea's question for me, and especially for new head teachers who are coming in. I always ask this question, even though it's daunting and we can be filled at times with self-doubt. If not you, then who? And therefore that makes you good enough. So it's not about who might be better at this, or no, it's not about that. You're exactly the right person at this exact time to do what it is that you need to do. And it's okay not to know certain things, but it's important that we recognise we will deal with it, but what will we need in moving forward and in facing that adversity? And I thought it was just a really good article, about his resilience.
Claire, as leaders in school, we're all very skilled and equipped at doing risk assessments, and we do the visioning what might happen at worst case scenario, and that catastrophizing is a CBT tool to help manage in worst case scenarios. And I think actually going through that process and that mental rehearsal of thinking, what will I do at worst case scenario? We don't need to dwell on it for too long, but actually really thinking about it and knowing how you will respond if you receive information that you deem to be worst case scenario. What will you do as a leader? And actually just rehearsing and playing that out really helps us respond successfully to that.
I agree. I think rehearsal is key to a lot of this, and in recent days we've seen a very good example of that. So the pubs reopened down south. And there were several pubs that then had to close. And I saw one landlady being interviewed, and she had taken it upon herself to contact every single person who had visited her pub on that first day of opening and that evening. And I thought, there's an example of an organisation, if you like, a company, who have mentally rehearsed, right, if this happens, then what will we do? It takes me back to critical incidents and leadership programs that I've been a part of, the SQH namely. But yeah, that mental rehearsal is such a good tool, and it's a good tool to go through a whole staff with as well at times.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, thanks very much for raising that. In moving us forward then, the stories that we have that bring us together, not just the tasks, but the stories that we tell, they do matter. And I have used a slide similar to this in the previous webinars for teachers, but I think it's important to check in with this as a leader, because we may find ourselves at times being part of the dynamic of the dreaded drama triangle, Stephen Cartman's drama triangle, which is fueled by anxiety and focused predominantly on the problems. And when we're at a time of heightened anxiety and recovery, we may have members of staff who are coming back feeling very anxious and feeling that they can perhaps go into that place of feeling like the victim, Cartman would describe it. And a victim is someone who feels quite powerless and quite hopeless about a situation. The danger with that is that as a school leader, we can then start to play the role of rescuer. We can try and fix it for a particular member of staff or a particular parent, if it needs to be a parent. And if we don't get that right for them, we can then become their persecutor. Or if we don't look at it in great detail, we become the persecutor already. So there is an opportunity there. If we've got planning that comes from a place of co-creation, if we come from a place of we're building this together, then we can enable others to feel that they can become creators, as David Emerald calls it. And instead of being focused on anxiety, it's been focused on our passions and what we can do and what we do want and what we do desire. What are the desired outcomes, what we are working towards. I also think it's good to look at then that, you know, it's not about being persecuted, it's about providing challenges that ignite the learning. And it's not about rescuing people, it's about holding that space in a coaching relationship for people to find their own solutions and their own answers, which I think lends itself nicely to that Scrum approach, that it's not the leader who has to find answers, but if we're all in this together, other members of the team can come up with different ways of viewing it and coming up with some solutions. I also recognise as a leader, I myself at times have gone into victim mode when I have felt overwhelmed, when I have felt anxious, and I've maybe looked to others to rescue me. And that's not always been resourceful for me, because it's left me feeling a little bit helpless. I've also maybe felt persecuted by workload, and maybe my story has been caught up at times with what I'm not getting done. So again, just being really using this tool to keep our focus on what we are here to create. We'll not get it all done. Things will go by the wayside, and we'll get it wrong. We're going to get it wrong sometimes. It doesn't mean we have to fall back to that place of being the victim. So moving on to this idea, because I think if we check in with ourselves then, recognise where perhaps we have gone to that place, and recognising that in fact if we go to that place, it's not good for me as an individual, it doesn't keep me regulated in a good place, and it'll not be good for others. If it's not good for others, it's not going to be good for me. And I suppose I want to make that link. I'm not saying throughout this that you have to be in a good place for others just for their sake. It's a two-way process. It's about you being in a good place or a resourceful place so that others can get on and do what they need to do and they feel okay about it, so that then you feel good about that. It is a two-way process in all of this, or it is quite cyclical. So looking at Goleman's emotionally intelligent leadership, some of the things that come up for me in this are recognising then, you know, he talks about these four areas: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship management. And for me, again, going back to that idea of self-awareness, knowing my strengths, knowing my drivers, but also knowing my limitations. And also accepting I don't need to know it all, and I don't need to be able to do everything. That perhaps, and one of the things I wasn't very good at times was delegation. And letting go of things. And sometimes I didn't want to let go of things because it was just easier for me to just, I'll just do it. But then of course that has a longer term issue where people become dependent on me doing things, and some things I just couldn't get to, so they're let down. but another part of me didn't want to burden people. And again, I've got to go back to the story that serves me best. It's all about learning. We're all here together to learn. And this is an opportunity at times to delegate something, to support people's own learning. So again, just it's a professional judgment, just checking in with ourselves there. Also, this idea of self-management, knowing for yourself, who is your safe space? I had a number of situations where I needed to walk away from situations because I maybe wasn't as self-regulated, just because it was overwhelming, or I'd had some difficult news to deal with within the community. So where do I go to? And again, I've had people, come to me at a time when in fact I've not maybe been as regulated. I've still got to make that person feel that they matter to me and what they're saying matters to me, but that I will come back to them. I just need to go and make a call, or I just need to get back to my office for a moment, but I'll come and see them later. Because again, it's about maintaining that support and trust with each other. Also, the kind of social awareness, recognising that others have needs and drivers, and when we're maybe caught up in a difficult conversation with someone, the thing is not the thing, I find, and just listening for our own triggers. And when I say listening, using our bodies to recognise where we're feeling triggered, and noticing that actually it's someone else's need and driver that may be mirrored to us, or it may be triggering us. So that social awareness is important too. And also relationship management, that in fact, I've listed a few things here, but ultimately, as a leader of a school, you've put all the safe space in place, the empathy is there, the compassion is there, but there are jobs to do, there are actions to take us forward, and your decision as a leader matters hugely to others. So being seen to take those decisions really seriously for yourselves as leaders, providing that body of trust to others. And I've also put in here just some of the non-verbal communication, just some ideas around how you can bring people to a place of regulation. I was listening to a lady who coached me, who talked about being at an Eddie Izzard concert. I know it's a bit off at a tangent, but a lady was sitting next to her who was really excitable and excited, and my coach's chair was moving up and down because the woman was moving about so much. So my coach decided to just start to tap at the same rhythm as the lady was moving next to her, and then started to tap more slowly to bring it down to a certain pace. And she found that the woman started to regulate that. So it's using our behaviours to bring people to that place that's going to make them feel better and make you feel better, and just some of the behaviours that will support us with that. So just a couple of slides to finish up just now, but great book, Viv Grant, Integrity Coaching, really good tips in it for staying ahead. She's been through the experience of being ahead, and has got lots of wisdom to share. Just want to pick up on a couple of points here. What I've got in brackets are some of the observations I've made in the last couple of webinars, that thankfully Viv resonates with me on, which is great. Well, imagine how gracious of me, huh? Something like that. But I suppose what I want to pick up on here is just again that idea of vulnerability, about taking ownership of outcomes. Everyone has agency, and that trust in allowing people just to take on tasks, what it does is it shows up our own vulnerability, and it shows up other people's vulnerability in them thinking, are they going to get it right? Is it going to be good enough for you? So again, it's that two-way relationship where we've got each other and we support each other. And I think the last one I'm going to pick up on in here is just this idea of the feedback matters. I'm very aware of having given feedback very successfully to staff at times, and I'm also very aware of when it's horribly gone wrong. So in a time of recovery, when we are feeling perhaps more fragile at times, and the resilience isn't always in the best place, just being aware of what feedback do you need as a leader right now, what's going to support you, even over this holiday. Do you need feedback from colleagues, from friends, from someone about how you've coped? Who's giving you that feedback? And also just your expectations of the feedback. Is it for validation or is it for constructive criticism just now? And the language of feedback. And also in August, how you will give that to others as well. So just a couple of points. And lastly, I just thought I'd finish up with who's on your A team, if you like. Reading an article from Bill George and colleagues at Harvard Business School on authentic leadership. And he talks about who's on your support team, and making sure that whoever is on your support team will allow you to be you unconditionally at times. Now, that isn't always the case in schools. You can't always be who you really want to be at times. It can be really challenging. But knowing that there are people you can be yourself with. And I like this quote, and here's some criteria that I thought was important for me in terms of who I need in my life. And a couple of quotes here. And what I would say about these quotes is that, you know, sometimes you've got to take a risk and trust people in good faith. And sometimes it doesn't work out. But good for you for putting your energy and time into a relationship you thought might flourish. But you will find as well that there are others you trust, and they will be your defenders for life. And I think as new head teachers as well, for those who are listening, as new leaders as well, just establishing, you know, your communities of support and who's got you, especially over the holidays. Now, I appreciate that over the summer holidays, there might be objects on your support team, such as certain beverages or certain foods at this particular time, or certain leisure activities. Whatever you do, I hope you have a good rest and recovery at this time, because that's imperative for you all. So thanks very much for your time and space today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you everybody for listening today. We have no further comments or questions for you, so it's nothing left to do but actually just to say thank you again once again for being involved today, for listening. If you do have any comments, please get in touch through communications@gtcs.org.uk. If you would like us to do any other webinars or suggestions, please feed in the survey. And thanks once again. Have a wonderful, wonderful, restful holiday.